Greetings all, my name is John, and this is The Single Truth. The Single Truth is all about getting the true word of the one true God out to the world in order to deepen your relationship with Jesus and hopefully to change lives for the better. Now today's episode is part 4 of Are the 10 Commandments Still Relevant Today? In part 1 we did commandments 1 through 3. In part 2 we did 5, 6, and 7, and last week we did 8, 9, and 10. So this week we will backtrack and go over the 4th commandment. So let's get started. Growing up as a kid, there were a lot of stores that were closed on Sundays. The exceptions to that were usually gas stations and grocery stores. But most stores where you would go to shop for clothes and other things, they were usually closed. And that was because of the 4th commandment, which we'll get to here in a minute. But as time went on, more and more of those stores would be open on Sunday. Now, was that because of greed or something else? Now, you as well may have been exposed to stores being closed on Sundays if, in your 50s or above. But even today, there are some stores that are closed on Sunday. Chick-fil-A comes to mind, for instance. Now, depending on what part of the country you live in, maybe there are other stores that are closed on Sunday as well. So now let's take a look at the 4th commandment and see what God says about the Sabbath day. In reality, anything that God instructs us to do is a commandment. But just about like everything else, there is a top 10 list. And the 10 commandments is God's top 10. But if you stick to these 10 commandments, by default, all other commands that He gives us will be followed. And the world would be a perfect place, once again, like it was before Adam and Eve messed that up. And it will be perfect again when Jesus comes back. But until then, we have to work with what we've got. So now the 4th commandment can be found in Exodus chapter 20 again, and this is verse 8, and it says this: Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the 7th day is the Sabbath day of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now, this commandment was originally given to Israel to remind them. Remember, these commandments were given to Moses on Mount Sinai once they'd been freed from Egypt, come through the Red Sea, and now they're on the other side of the Red Sea at Mount Sinai. So this commandment was originally given to Israel to remind them of the bondage that God had delivered them from the Egyptian bondage, because slaves were not allowed to rest. Okay, the rest you got was when you finished for the day, you went home that night and you got up the next day to do it all again. So there was no rest for slaves. So He gives them this command to remind them of that deliverance He got them through. And also, as we read just now in here, and we find in Genesis 2, God rested on the 7th day. After He created everything in 6 days, then He rested. And again, that's Genesis 2:2. Now He gave Israel this command, the 4th commandment, and also us as a precursor to Christ. Because in Christ, that's where we find our ultimate rest. Now the rest that Genesis 2 speaks of, where God rested, it's not the kind of rest we think about where, all right, I'm finished everything, now I'm just going to kick back and watch TV. No, God rested from His work that He had completed. That is creating everything. So He was resting from that. He's still at work, but He rested from that creation aspect of things. And again, the 4th commandment points, for us and Israel, points towards Christ, who is our ultimate rest. Because in Matthew 11:28, here's what Jesus says: Come to me, and I will give you rest. Okay, this is Jesus talking to His disciples and us. Come to me and I will give you rest. Not in a specific day do we find rest. All right, we find it in a specific person, and that is Jesus. So this commandment is not repeated in the New Testament. There's not a specific day to set aside to rest. Now, a little more on that later. Okay, so don't throw a party yet saying, woo, we don't have a commandment we don't have to follow. You don't, because it's not repeated, but there's a little more later on it. So, we find our ultimate rest in Jesus, a person, not a day. Now, the Apostle Paul tells us over in the book of Colossians, chapter 2, verse 16 and 17. Here's what the Apostle Paul is telling to the people in Colossus when he wrote this letter, and to us when he wrote this letter to them. So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. So what Paul is saying here, a little bit before this, he was talking about legalism. Okay, and what he's talking about in this passage is the Jewish leaders of that day had put such a burden on their people that laws and oral traditions that they had made up. Okay, he put such a burden on them that you could practically do nothing on the Sabbath day. Okay, so you couldn't even cut your fingernails because that was considered work. Now, in other parts of the Bible, Jesus confronts these leaders with this and says, all right, if you had a sheep that fell into a hole on the Sabbath, would you not go rescue it? Well, yeah, you would. But according to their old oral traditions, then you're breaking the Sabbath. You're not resting because you're doing some work. So Jesus was confronting them with their hypocrisy and their futility of being legalistic in following their man-made traditions. Okay, these people, the Jewish leaders, come up with these traditions and regulations, not God. So what Paul is saying here is, we find our rest, like Jesus said, we are finding our rest in Christ, and that He will judge us. Okay, people shouldn't judge us on their ideas of the Sabbath. Okay, these Jewish leaders were judging these people. Oh, you shouldn't do this. It's the Sabbath. So what Paul is saying here is our rest is in Christ, just like Jesus said, and not the oral traditions of the Jewish leaders. Now, over in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Jesus kind of says the same thing. Now, what's going on here in the background of this is Jesus is walking along with his disciples, and it's the Sabbath, and they're picking grains of wheat, because they're hungry, so they're picking grains of wheat out of a farmer's field and eating it. So now the Pharisees, the leaders of that day, get a hold of this, and they're saying, hey, you're doing what's not right on the Sabbath. Okay, you're picking grain. That's work. Okay, you're working on the Sabbath, picking grain, harvesting the crops. And then Jesus reminds them, do you not know what David did? When his men was on the run, back in David's day, they went to a temple and they took the showbread and ate it because they were hungry. And that was only allowed for the priest. So Jesus was telling them, do you not remember that? And, that was okay because, man is more important than observing your oral and legalistic traditions, which we'll see here again in a second. But now here's what Jesus tells them. This is Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Okay, and he said to them, this is after all that about David and what I was just telling you, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man, which is Jesus talking about himself, is also Lord of the Sabbath. Okay, so what he's saying is God made a day of rest for man, not man for the Sabbath. Okay, again, God created that day of rest for us, for man. He did not create us to observe a certain day. Okay, so that's what Jesus is telling these guys. You do work on the Sabbath if it needs to be done, something needs to be done. And I am Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus is telling them. So I'm telling you what this command is, not there's like 630 some odd oral legalistic traditions that these leaders had come up with. So Jesus is telling them, I made this day. I created this day, not you. And I'm telling you what it's for, not your stuff. So God gave us a day of rest for our benefit, not his own. Now, if you think about this, the Jewish leaders, with all their legalistic and oral traditions, it seems to me they were working harder, okay? They were working harder at keeping their legalistic traditions on the Sabbath than they would have been just by taking that day of rest. Okay, they were working harder at observing those and making sure others were observing them. Okay, because if you're out tattletaling, ain't you working? Ain't you going out and going back and telling other leaders, hey, these guys aren't observing the Sabbath? Isn't that work? So they were kind of hypocritical in their own thing because they were out working, you know, being big brother, watching everybody else to make sure they weren't doing the stuff that they were actually doing. Hypocrisy. And all throughout the New Testament, Jesus confronts them on their hypocrisy of this and other things as well. So again, God made that day for our benefit and not to observe a specific day. So again, the fourth commandment is not repeated in the New Testament. And we'll get here in a second, you'll see that you still need to do a little rest, but it's different. So let's get to that. So, since the fourth commandment is not repeated in the New Testament, how does that apply to you? Well, as I had just said, God made that day of rest for our benefit, okay? There are times you need to set aside to recharge, okay? You got to recharge those batteries, both physically and spiritually, okay? So it's not just a day of physical rest. You need to recharge the batteries, you know, focus more on Christ, and here's how we do that. Okay, we take that day to recoup, again, because we can physically, in these current bodies, we can physically wear out, okay? Now, when we get our new glorified bodies, that's not going to happen. But right now, we need to take that time to rest. And again, it's not a command, but He does make that day for our benefit. Now, what you do, if you're daily in the Word praying, okay, if you're meditating over His Word, if you're daily reading His Scriptures, you're going to get recharged spiritually, okay? And the mind is what controls the body. So if you're daily in His Word, which you should be, and again, praying, meditating on that Word, you're going to get that resurgence of power, okay, through Christ. Our rest is in Him, okay? We get that power through Him, meditating on His Word, praying. Now, that's going to recharge you spiritually, which is going to recharge you physically, because again, the mind works the body. And you won't need to set aside a day to rest and recoup, okay? That's why Jesus says we find our rest in Him. You get into His Word daily, that's going to recharge you. And as I just said, you won't need that day to catch up on your recharging your batteries, plugging yourself in by sitting on the couch and resting or whatever. So get daily into that Word. Read His Word. Pray and meditate on that Word. And that's where you'll find your rest, as Jesus said and as Paul said in that Colossians passage. So that's how we get our rest in Christ. As believers, we are reminded by Jesus that His yoke is easy and His burden is light. Okay, we get all the power and strength that we need in and through Him. He is our rest. He is the one who gets us through each and every day through His rest, not just one day a week. Okay, it doesn't apply to just one day a week. So that's where we find our rest, is in Him. Now, as a non-believer, your burden is going to be heavy and your yoke is not going to be easy. Okay? Why? Because you're trying to do it under your own power. And you're just not powerful enough to face those struggles that every one of us have each and every day. Okay, so your burden is not going to be light, or your yoke's not going to be light, and your burden's not going to be easy. Okay, now, so I would urge you to turn your life over to Christ, because He is the all-powerful one, the all-knowing one who can get you through those struggles, as I just said, that we all have every day. Now, don't delay, because there's going to come a day you keep delaying and keep delaying, trying to do it on your own. You keep getting more frustrated because you can't really do it on your own. There's going to come a day that you're delaying, and that day is going to be too late. Because the Bible does tell us we are not guaranteed tomorrow. So I would urge you today, now, put your faith in Christ, accept Him. And you're still going to have struggles like you do now. But you'll have one on your side who can get you through those struggles, because you find your rest in Him. So don't delay.